All right, welcome back to week 4. So, last week we talked about the early prophets and how they were trying to construct history for the nation of Israel and the people of God. And I talked about like how we break the Nevi'im into 3 parts essentially. We have the early prophets, which is more historical in nature, and then we have the major and the minor prophets. So this week you are reading through the major and the minor prophets, and as I've said previously, as I've tried to indicate previously, and as I'm saying right now, it is a lot. It is a lot to dive into. It's a lot to try to process and understand, particularly when you begin to fixate on the historicity of what you are reading with times, dates, rulers, things of that nature. It's a lot. It has always been a lot for me. And even as someone who has read multiple versions of the Bible, multiple translations of the Bible, has read multiple commentaries on the Bible, the prophets still give me pause. That said, here's the other side of that. The prophets, I would say, far and away are the most interesting parts of the Hebrew Scriptures. And depending on which month it is or how much coffee I've had, I would say the prophets are probably the most interesting parts of the Bible for me, particularly because there's so much social commentary, there's so much political commentary, there's so much religious commentary. I mean, there is a lot to process that has nothing to do with the history itself. In rabbinical thinking, in Jewish thinking, a lot of attention is given to the prophets. There is a rabbi in the 20th century who, his name was Abraham Joshua Heschel. And Heschel, I think, is one of the first people who really opened the door for me to understand the prophets. And one of the things that he points out is that the prophets are really writing after having lost everything. They are looking at the consequences of the decisions that the early leadership of the nation, the decisions that they made. They are writing from a chronological and historical perspective after the fall of the Davidic dynasty. After David has died, his son Solomon ascends to the throne, and Solomon's great accomplishment is that he will build the temple based off of the plans that David would have put together. And so he will oversee the construction of the temple, and by all rights, this really should be a period where the nation will flourish. I mean, after all, they are becoming a military superpower. They have a beautiful temple in the middle of their country. They have access to tremendous amounts of land. They're really settling into the nation that has always been envisioned, or that their ancestors had always envisioned. And yet, despite all of this, what we see is that after Solomon is no longer king, the nation will split in two, and it will continue to break apart and break apart and break apart and break apart. And it will break apart along those lines of military, society, civility, religion. All of these things will be upended. And the nation itself will turn against itself and will not even begin to recognize itself. And ultimately, this division will make them subject to other nations looking at this fracturing, and they will exploit and take advantage of this, and will lead many of the people of God into not only exile, but in many cases, slavery. And Daniel is one of the prophets who writes about this and says that he was a well-off family. It is very clear that he has learned before he even is led into captivity, along with his friends. This is very much the college student of his time. This is probably the best time of his life, and he is captured and then led into slavery. And what he finds is that he excels. Everywhere he goes, he is a great leader, he is a great thinker, and he is known for this. But with that comes a great deal of criticism because of his private life. His private life is very much a rejection of the society around him. He is still trying to align with the ideals that were written about in the Torah, about food, customs, folkways, Not necessarily the laws, but just because, as you've already read, the Torah also addresses itself to food and folkways. And so he's trying to have this foreign culture in a foreign nation, and it really just puts a target on him that he is not going to be liked for those reasons. And while politically he may be seen as a great advisor, in terms of his culture, he is rejected. In other corners of the prophets, we see someone like Ezekiel, who Ezekiel was a priest of his time, and when his chronicle, when his prophecies start, he has lost everything. It is clear, kind of working through what he is writing about, that he is trying to look forward to a future point. And here, I would say we have a misunderstanding of what prophecy is. Like we talked about last week, when we culturally, today, in 2025, culturally, when we speak of someone being a prophet, particularly in terms of religious language, what we mean is someone who is a seer, someone who can look into the future and can talk about the things that they see hundreds and perhaps thousands of years into the future. And Ezekiel does that to some extent, but it seems that what he is actually talking about is not so much that he will see this great city coming down from on high, like Isaiah talks about, and this new city will kind of take over and will be a superpower under itself. It seems like Ezekiel is actually just saying that he has lost everything. He has lost his wife, he has lost his family, he has lost his neighbors. They have all died. He himself has found himself in a new nation. He is restarting from ground zero. He has nothing. And his entire way of life, his entire religion has just been upended. Everything that he believed in has been set to the side, and in many cases has just been entirely upended. He does not know what is true. And in this, it's not that he sees a great city descending from the sky like Isaiah will talk about, but instead he is looking forward to a point where things will not be so chaotic, where life will begin to make sense again, where people will be restored to their families. Otherwise, if we look at Ezekiel on the page, there are very strange things that he talks about, like looking up into the sky and seeing not a city, but a wheel within a wheel. If I, here in 2025, were to tell you that I looked up on my walk through my neighborhood yesterday, and in the sky I saw a wheel spinning within another wheel, you would say, bruh, it sounds like you saw a UFO. We would think that you would probably think that something is wrong with me mentally and that I should check on my psychological wellness. I should find a higher form of care. I think the same is also true of Ezekiel. I'm not saying that he saw UFOs, because the way that he describes it is that this is an angel that he saw in the sky. But I think that there's definitely something to be said about Ezekiel as an individual, as a historical figure, and even as a character, that this is the result of having lost everything. This is someone who more than likely had a mental breakdown and is chronicling what that mental breakdown is like. That when you lose everything, this is what that feels like internally. Having lost his wife, having lost his neighbors, having lost his entire family, having lost his way of life, having lost his religion, having to kind of restart and rethink everything, it can make you crazy. It can bring you to the point of madness, and that resonates a great deal. I think that if you were put into that same position, you would probably feel the same way. So we probably want to be generous to the prophets, not only seeing them as individuals who are able to see into the future, maybe, but also trying to articulate what it is to experience this loss of life, this loss of religion, this loss of society as you know it, the upending of everything. We see this again in Isaiah, who is kind of, as an exile, as an outsider, is looking at the nations around and saying, look, this is how it worked for us. It didn't go well for us. This is how it's not going to go well for you. Isaiah is very much a political speaker. Not someone who is able to kind of see hundreds and thousands of years into the future, but as someone who is able to say, look, this did not work for us, and it's not going to work for anyone. Here is how this led to our own destruction. We see this chronicled not just in the cities, like with Isaiah and Daniel. We see this even in the farmlands with what's called the minor prophets. And so you have people who are in the farmlands, like Amos, who do all kinds of different agricultural farming. I mean, we live in the South. You know what farming is. I don't need to explain that to you. We also see insights into how marriages are breaking down. And so Hosea will talk about his own family, his wife leaving him. She probably feels the same devastation and the same loss of identity that we are seeing in all the other prophets. And this will lead us into what's called the intertestamental period, when the major prophets and the minor prophets are no longer writing things down. We will move into what's called the intertestamental period. And in biblical studies, we'll get into this more next week. In biblical studies, the intertestamental period, particularly if you are in a Christian or an evangelical religious community, if you go to church, in an evangelical or a Christian church, what you will hear about is the silence of the prophets, that there will be hundreds of years where the prophets are no longer speaking, and this will kind of set the stage and set John the Baptist in particular apart as the first speaker who will bring about a new era of God's activity among the people of God. And that's not exactly true. In the intertestamental period, we have several other people who claim to be prophets who are also writing histories, writing cultural narratives, writing political treatises, just like the major, minor, and even the early prophets. And they're trying to make sense of their world as well. And yet, for a number of reasons, both the Jewish canon or the Hebrew canon and the Christian canon will exclude those voices. We'll talk some more about that, and you'll read more about that next week with Harris. For now, you have a lot on your plate, talking about the early prophets, the major prophets, and the minor prophets. And one last thought here before I kind of close this video out is that when we talked about the early prophets last week, one of the ideas that I raised is that some of what the early prophets or the histories that they're writing, some of the things that they're saying, you kind of want to keep a closed eye. You want to keep one eye open and one eye closed with that. Primarily because what they're doing is they are trying to rewrite the history in light of the destruction that will come about. They're trying to kind of elevate David as this great leader, this great figure, and kind of ignore the fact that David was a man after God's own heart, sure, but he was also a man of war. He led the nation into war after war after war. He was not a good father. It's very clear at the latter end of his life that he will go into exile yet again, just like he did in the early part of his life with Saul. He will find himself in exile, out of the throne, out of Jerusalem entirely, because of the activities that he had in that intermediate state where he was married, but he was dipping into a couple of other wells. He was finding himself in other people's beds, and this will inevitably catch up with him. And so his son will put him on the run, will claim kingship, and David will say, maybe I deserve it. Some of the things that I did, they were pretty messed up. And later, we will talk about Solomon and how Solomon was this wise king. And Solomon will house all of his wives in what we would call today as a harem, or a house of prostitution, you might say. I don't know that he was exactly a good husband in that sense. And so the major and minor prophets, just like the early prophets, will kind of look back to the past, and they will tell more of the truth than the early prophets who were writing the history. They will object to a great number of the characterizations that are being laid down about people like Saul and about David. And as I introduced to you last week, what was Saul's great mistake? What was his great fault? That he didn't want to go to war. And what was the reason why David was celebrated? Because he did. I'm not sure that really qualifies you to be a leader. And this will come up again in the major and minor prophets when they will say, maybe there was something to that. Like, we always, as a nation, wanted to make war. We got ourselves into situations that we didn't really need to get into the middle of. For what? Why did we do it? Were we really listening to God, or were we imagining all of that? Was that this weaponization of religion in terms of politics? Let's deconstruct that and let's try to understand that. When we were insisting that this is what a marriage looks like, we find that that didn't work for us, let's reconsider that. When we talked about what it means to be a husband, what it means to be a wife, again, we need to reconsider all of that. And so the major and minor prophets will provide something of a referendum on the histories that have been written down, and also at times on the Torah itself. They will begin to look at the laws and the ways in which they live those laws, and in that intertestamental period, you will see the religion continue to split into multiple factions. We will get into that next week, where we'll start talking about things like the Pharisees and the Sadducees and how they came about. For right now, it's enough for us to understand that everything that we thought that we knew has just been blown apart. For political, for civil, for social reasons, it has been entirely blown apart. And putting a religious name on that, baptizing it in God's name, doesn't make it better. It still makes it evil. It's just evil with God's name on it.